we're going to be starting off with a panel now, and I'll just wait for maybe 1 more minute before one of our panelists joins. So basically, the idea behind this panel is that there are many communities and identities that are in general, because of the kind of society that we live in, face marginalizations and exclusion from a number of different services and from a number of different platforms which are necessary for their own personal well-being and community well-being. Now, these marginalities largely affect not just access, but the way in which one perceives themselves. And in the field of mental health, of late, we've had a number of perspectives coming in which talk about how the problem or the mental health issue does not lie in the person or in the psyche per se, but in the socio-political location of a person. And it is the socio-political location that usually amplifies the way in which a person experiences either mental health issues or trauma. Now, given this context, there are a number of different ways in which mental health professionals and practitioners have been trying to make sure that mental health services are more accessible, that mental health services are accessible to people from marginalized communities. And I will speak about this maybe from my own personal experience to place a little bit of context into what is going to, on what this is about. As a trans person who has been going through for the better half of my adulthood, some of the other form of mental health illness or issues. It has been really difficult to move away from pathologization of trauma that is not necessarily internal. Many a times there is a perspective within mental health which internalizes almost all issues and does not realize that a lot of the triggers that we actually face are from outside. And I'll give you one example for that. And that is that when I talk about gender dysphoria as a trans woman, gender dysphoria is not something that I intrinsically or inherently feel about myself. Gender dysphoria is more about how other people make me feel not normal. Right? The idea of normalcy within myself is pretty much there, but the idea of somebody else making me feel abnormal is where the idea of dysphoria actually gets triggered for me. Similarly, the same case with a number of different marginalizations that experience this differently. Having given this a little bit of context, I would like to introduce the panelists that will be speaking today. The first panelist that we have is Ms. Jehanzeb Baldiwala, who's the Director of Health Services, Mental Health Services and Ummeed Child Development Center. Then we have Shivangi Agrawal. Shivangi Agrawal is a queer disabled activist and works with Determined Art Movement. We have Preeti Nangal, who's a freelance writer and journalist. And we have Rashi, who's a co-team member at Mindpiper. This would be our panel for today. And we will, and yeah, I can see almost everyone. Preeti, if you could switch on your video and your audio for a minute. Hi, hello everyone.
Hello.
Okay, so the way in which we are going to be taking forward the format of this panel is going to be that first we are going to have Preeti and Shivangi speaking about experiences of being part of communities that have difficult, or of people who have accessed mental health care services or are service providers themselves, but have faced challenges in various ways in accessing them. We'll start with that, and then we have Jehanzeb and Rashi, who will be taking on the perspective of mental health practitioners more, and then talking about how to make the profession or the services more accessible in various different ways. So apart from the introductions that I gave, as I'm going to be asking questions, I would request that each of you, as I come to them, you can give a little bit more about context about your work and yourself, and then we could go on with the questions, because I'm pretty sure I was not able to encompass the holistic nature of the work that you are and the people that you are just with those few lines. So we will start with Preeti. In the meanwhile, while Preeti is speaking, I would request everybody else to switch off their audios and videos so that we don't have any bandwidth. And okay, so Preeti, do you want to start off with maybe introducing yourself and anything that I might have missed out? I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you, Sai. And first of all, thanks to Belongg team for organizing this. So I'm Preeti, and like Sai said, I'm a freelance writer and journalist. I write narrative nonfiction and fiction, long form fiction, and I've written for First Post, and I presented my work at Jaipur Literature Festival in 2019. I've been a user of mental health services for about like 6 years
Awesome.
now, and I hope that sharing some of my experience today will encourage useful conversations.
Awesome. Okay, so Preeti, to start off, I would like to ask you a question regarding your own experiences, particularly. So, as a person accessing mental health care services, what are the challenges largely that you face? And also, how can mental health professionals ensure inclusive services which are cognizant of their social location?
So I think when such question is posed, the first question that pops up in my head is how does one talk about identity and location of um, when an individual comes from like such a complex web of so many experiences and locations. So I think it's like to begin with, it's important to understand that even if some identities may be dominant, there are so many others that are informing that position. So having said that, I think I'll try to like cover a few broad points here in order to answer your question. So I've been living in a small town in Meerut in UP, which is like a suburban area, and going to a local school, English medium though, but there is no conversation around mental health there. So, but as like a curious person, I was always on the internet trying to like read about things that interest me, and so when I started like sensing that something is not right with me, that I'm crying a lot, I've lost interest in everything, and when I like go to internet and try to read on it, and I come across terms like depression, etc. So like, and that's almost still where my engagement with mental health terminology or like existence itself of a branch like mental health comes into picture. But it was only when I left the suburban area and I went to Delhi to study in Delhi University that I am able to seek mental health um, help from a professional, because my college has a free counseling service. So I think when we talk about access and the challenges that one faces, this shift in geography in my context becomes very important. Um, and this also, I think, poses the question that if I continued staying in my hometown, what would my situation have looked like? Apart from talking about geography and this context that I talked about, which is like a complex location, which is a mix of identities, two other things that are important when talking about challenges in accessing these services is of fee, the payment, and also the information that the therapists themselves have of these broad history, like say national history for that matter, and like what that itself constitute of. So in my experience, since I could not afford going to a private therapist, I was seeking um, I was like going seeking mental health help from channels that did not ask for money from me. So that was a very important factor, and that also directly correlates with my anxiety in terms of that how prepared these therapists are in order to like tackle or take my situation seriously. Also because if it's free of cost, then it means that there's more influx, so there's no filtering system. So I think that is where the anxiety of how as an individual patient would I be taken seriously. But apart from that, there was also one instance where I had recently started engaging with my caste identity. So here also it becomes in fact interesting that for the longest time I thought that my problems were related to class and gender issues, and suddenly I come across my caste identity, and it's like now I'm not just a woman, I'm a Dalit woman. And it's just like it shifted something in my head, and so much was happening in GNU at CU during that time, and it was directly impacting my mental health. And I go to this service, and and I tell the counselor therapist that all this is affecting me a lot. And it was interesting for me that the person did not know about this at all. And all this was happening in Delhi, like when like so much information is already going to and fro in a metropolitan city like Delhi. Then, and if you don't know about these ongoing events, then what does it say about a person trying to provide help to me? So I felt, and also I think this also contributes into some sort of dismissal and erasure itself of the experience, even though I felt that it did not impact me directly because I had my circle outside the therapy space. But to imagine that someone not having external help, what this sort of erasure or like not knowing about one's history would mean to an individual. Just to like quickly answer your second question with respect to like how the therapist can be cognizant. Okay, so coming from my personal experience, I think something that would really help is sincere assurance that even if the therapist coming from their location, like it's not possible to know everything under the sun, which is like understandable, but I think this sincere assurance that having these conversations come up in the therapy session will be taken seriously, and that the therapists themselves would try to inform themselves more about the complexities that these individual identities and experiences bring up would be very useful.
Awesome. So, just to take it forward from there, I think how you spoke about your experience of seeking mental health and also your experience of trying to negotiate around your own community and your own identity in that matter. I would like to ask you, what is the role of like primary social circles, that is like immediate friends and family, in shaping one's response to mental health issues?
So I think that's a very important question, and it's something that has that I actively engage with because I feel coming from the location that I come from, it's not always possible for me to clarify or find an identification of my issues in the therapy setting, given the location of the therapist. And that's not because that they are not trying their best, perhaps, but just that if one comes from a different location, then there is some sort of gap in acknowledging that experience, or like understanding the complexities of it. And there's like so much more that I would have to do in order to inform the therapist than them coming or being informed themselves. So in that scenario, I think the like just like um, so much information that we have available to us through internet is, I think, just like my first resource, where I'm reading so much more online, and that helps me in finding my vocabulary. Like even if one would want to take this with a pinch of salt, what one finds or on internet, and not like how much can one trust this information, but that it helps one with identifying vocabulary terminology that would help in an individual to be able to talk about their experience. Um, but then also a caveat here, because most of this information is in English language. So I think that limitation is also very important to address. Apart from that, I think my family kind of becomes very important to talk about here, in the sense that when I seek mental health therapy, and I'm talking to professionals and trying like bring myself on a journey of self healing, what it does to my experience and engagement with my family is that since they have not yet started acknowledging the intergenerational trauma they have, the historical oppression and deprivation they have been through, it makes me sort of unrecognizable for them, because I am not replicating the same say anger issues, or blaming someone else for my problems. And I think that is a huge challenge for me, and that also tends to like gaslight me in return, um, because my perception and my sense and understanding of my history and communal history kind of does not match their reality, their own understanding. So I think that's an important challenge here. But also something that I would like to talk about later is how spaces of spaces created by friends who are self-aware, who are aware about mental health discourse is also something that becomes a useful resource when traditional spaces like of a therapy does not exactly help you.
Thank you so much, Preeti, for that. And also, like, I would actually say how specifically for people who are going through mental health issues, it is extremely difficult to articulate and talk about it. And I'm just like reaching out with virtual love and hugs to everybody who's going to be speaking on this panel today, and everybody who's listening in and who has this experience. One little line that I would like to add here, like because we have a lot of international participants, just to explain what caste is. So caste is basically a social stratification in India, which India and South Asia actually, which largely creates communities on the basis of hierarchy, and it is structural and it is basically all-encompassive in the South Asian context. So yeah, and the people who were formerly considered untouchables identify with the word Dalit as a self-identified identity, as a self-prescribed identity of assertion. So now moving on to the last question for you, Preeti. How have you negotiated with your mental health apart from traditional forms of therapy? Like how do you think, apart from seeking therapy professionally, what are the ways in which mental health gets negotiated by a person?
So like the note that I ended my last answer on was that spaces created by your friends who are like self-aware and are informed by mental health discourse has been a very useful resource. And I think in that, in same vein, spaces like I'm going to take two names that have been very useful for me personally. One is Blue Dawn and the other is Unsound. Um, and these two become important for me individually is because they address two very important issues for me, which is one, funding, and the other is of not finding spaces where you can openly talk about your experience without being judged for it. So like I think these two alternative spaces have been very useful for me, and I think maybe I can like just briefly talk about what these spaces do. So Blue Dawn, apart from like providing funding to Dalit Bahujan people to seek therapy, they also try to organize workshops, etc., in order to initiate these conversations in say with Dalit Bahujan people. And Unsound is a space which works with the perspective of intersectionality while seeking mental health services, and also what this mental health experience means when so many identities come together. And they also have a fellowship, and I'm a fellow with them, and we are working on our own individual projects where we are trying to initiate these same conversations in our own specific locations. So I think these forms are very important. These spaces are very important in order to negotiate when traditional forms of therapy kind of have their own limitation. And just briefly to mention here that it's also important here that when say something like we talk about mental health services in these spaces or mental health help, um, the identities also become more complex than they already are, because then we just don't have the traditional sort of identities that we talk about, say these broad rubrics of caste and class and gender. But it's also that the way mental health informs you, your experience informs you, also becomes an identity in itself. So I think having conversations around these is what these spaces also allow.
Okay, thank you so much, Preeti. That's actually a very important point that you brought up. That apart from seeking professional help, a sense of belonging is also something that is very necessary for any person who's going through mental health issues. To go on to the next panelist, I would like to ask Shivangi to possibly switch on the video and audio so that we can go forward. Okay, thank you so much, Shivangi. To start with, I would like to ask you if you would want to say something else about yourself and the work that you do, apart from the introduction that I already gave, if there's anything that you would like to add.
Yeah, sure, I can add a little bit. So I'm Shivangi, and I'm a queer disabled activist here in Delhi, as Sai already mentioned. I also work with an artist collective called Determined Art Movement to make art accessible with community belongingness, socio-political conversations, dance, and painting, wall painting therapy. Um, I have trained to become an accessibility consultant, and I'm currently also learning about spiritual healing and tarot from my partner.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shivangi. So I'll actually start with the questions for you. Like, one basic question is like, what is the role of alternative therapies, as you were mentioning, in the field of mental health, and what has your experience been in practicing these therapies?
So for me, my experience has been like I feel that therapy, which is the traditional kind of therapy where there is just talking involved, is very inaccessible. I think that it's therapy has been very inaccessible. Psychology in general, psychologists in general have been very inaccessible for people with disabilities because we have such varying degrees of ways of communicating and alternative needs of communicating. For me, I have difficulty sharing my feelings because of the socio-cultural background that I come from, and I don't have that practice where I can continuously share my feelings, but without being judged for for what I feel and what my body is. So like a lot of therapy, I feel like there isn't a lot of understanding of the body, and there's no conversation about the body, which is the most important thing for disabled people, where we can freely express what we go through, what our bodies need, what our bodies need. Like even our toilet training and all those kinds of things, those are very important kind of things that we need to talk about. And even bathing, all those things are never really talked about in therapy. And even if there is talking, like there is no alternative ways of expressing those things. Yeah, I mean, and also like personally, when I have you know been in therapy or approached a therapist or a counselor, it's always like I'm being judged for my non-productivity. And there is always this thing that disabled people go through, where people are like, oh, you're such an inspiration, you're so brave, and you can do this and you can do that. But there's no real understanding of like why we we don't want to do certain things, or that we don't that we need rest, that we why we need rest and why rest is important. So I think what you asked about, like alternative ways of therapies that have worked for me, are like I said, art, painting, and craft. Those are things that I've like when I do it like in a community based environment or with friends or something, then it's always a very healing thing. Then also with animals, like I have a cat. And I also like before like a lot of disabled people actually have a very complicated relationships with animals. A lot of people in India, actually a lot of disabled people in India, because of the fear of street dogs on the street. A lot of dogs on the streets, like they chase us. A lot of times there's a fear that disabled people have, especially physically disabled people like me. So for me, like having to interact with dogs and cats and other animals, it has been very healing for me and my body to kind of be able to reclaim my space on the streets with the street dogs and the street animals. So that is another very important aspect for me. And then, like I said, spiritual healing, understanding tarot and understanding my own birth chart. And maybe it sounds superstitious for some people, but actually it is it really opens you up to understanding others and yourself when you look at like the planetary movements and the cosmic, the nature of the cosmic environment around us. And then another thing that I've like really grown up with is dance and music. So that is another form of therapy that really works for me, and creative expression in any way. And especially with dance, like it has to be like any kind of body movement, not like beautiful and like really good looking kind of dance or therapy, but just being able to move your body and like in creative ways, and also being able to make sounds with, uh, with your throat. So like having coordination between your throaty sounds and your body. So just making sounds like like those kinds of things, along with body movements has been really helpful. So like music that comes from me, within me. And then of course like support groups are another thing that really helped me. There is this really amazing disabled activist called Mia Mingus, who talks about pods, PODS, and she talks about how pods are kind of like a close knit group of people that and it not like a community, but like it goes beyond to define community and say that pods are people who can be accountable to each other when they're facing an issue, or when there is a certain case of violence, or there's those kinds of things. So that and that preaches for prison abolition, and also economic rights. So like understanding, like in support groups, like understanding the law, politics and economic rights that come with having coming from a marginalized group is really really therapeutic, like especially understanding the law and economic rights for people with disabilities, for queer people. So that's another thing. And I think that's what I had to say for that question. Also, like I feel a lot of, like, for me, even when I feel like these things maybe are not working and I need an individual based therapy, I feel that there is no disabled therapist, no disabled counselor. There's no trans or queer therapist or counselor, or very few of them, and they. A lot of, like, especially with people, counselors who are equipped with understanding disability issue, then they're not equipped with understanding queer issues. So that's another thing that yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. The struggle is real. So the other question that I had is actually borrowing from the last point that you made regarding how identities impact us, and how that becomes difficult while seeking therapy. How an understanding of that is something that is necessary. So my next question borrows from that, and it is: do you think people who come from socio-political marginalities of caste, class, disability, gender, etc., are pathologized in mental health practice?
I definitely think so, because I have read a lot about, like, industrial complexes, and I feel like there is a mental health industrial complex which comes with where the mental health industry has become kind of a money making institution. So there's like institutionalization of mental health, where when we go to colleges, when we go to schools, then our fees, like, we are forced to kind of pay for mental health practitioners, for mental health services that may not be accessible to us. And that is institutionalization of mental health, where we where that therapy is not accessible to us, and even then we are forced to pay for it to get an education. And then there is privatization of mental health on the other side, where there is companies and organizations that have privatized mental health practices. And already, like, disabled people are stuck in institutions disabled and sick people are usually stuck in institutions of mental health, and we want to get out of those things. We don't want to be in four walls. We don't want to be because that's already happening with us. We're already imprisoned in those kind of situations. And what we want prison, like we want those kinds of things to be abolished. We don't want to be we want more accountability instead of being criminalized and being separated. um, and I feel like, so when because I also have a background in studying psychology. I feel like I actually joined a master's. When I joined a master's program in clinical psychology, most of the classmates or the students that I met there were in it, for the money and for the trend, and they had no idea what counseling is, what therapy is, what clinical psychology is, the history in their own environment. And yeah, I mean, like most of the students, they came from like commerce backgrounds, which is very curious. Why? Like commerce is a very money based kind of background, and coming to therapy when you're going after your in your higher education, it's curious why so many commerce people are joining psychology programs, why they want to be counselors. It's very curious to me. And I feel like most of them, they want to work in like big industries, and they will be happier like working for someone like Google rather than their own communities. So that is also a big thing that I saw when I was in this program, and I didn't relate to that. And I feel like even the institution that I was in, like, kind of propagated that kind of a belief. So I left. I didn't feel that it was accessible, and that wasn't the only reason. Like, there was other reasons that I was facing. And like I said before in the previous question about how there is no disabled or queer or trans therapists or counselors, we don't see them in the institutions that certify you as a counselor or as a therapist. And yeah, I think that's all I had to say about that question. I hope that made sense.
It did. It actually, to gain that also perspective that looking at healthcare in general as a necessity as compared to something that needs to be provided as a service, and how for professionals, when you professionalize it and when there's an industry around it, then it is easier to talk about it as that. But as people who are trying to access, it becomes a little difficult. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, like, there is a lot of in the mental health institutions and mental health practices that a lot of people propagate for. There is a lot of, like I said before, push for talking. Just talk, just baat karo, like, just talk. But like, talking is
Yeah.
not easy and it's not accessible. A lot of people who are deaf and mute, they cannot talk. A lot of people who have other physical and intellectual disabilities cannot talk. So what does
Yeah.
that mean for people with disabilities?
That's so true. Okay, thank you so much, Shivangi.
Yeah,
We will
thank you.
we'll try to hurry this up a little because we have
Sure.
little less time. We're running like around 5 minutes late. So I would call on Jehanzeb next. So Jehanzeb, to start with, would you want to introduce yourself apart from what I had said?
No,
Or
I'm happy with what you said. Just want to say I'm really excited to be here, and a very big thank you to the Belongg team for having me here.
okay, thank you so much. So just going ahead with the conversation on the questions that I'll be asking you. To start with, to be very quick, how has the profession of being a mental health practitioner evolved in India? Because you've been practicing for quite a while now, and what has your experience been of this evolution?
So I think, in the years that I've been practicing, I think some of the things that I probably didn't see when I started off, maybe, 20 years ago, that I see much more of is conversations around intersectionality. Like when we started training, psychology was still, talking very much from a deficit-based, internalized version of mental health issues and problems, where people were sort of viewed as having problem identities or mental illnesses. And there was zero conversation about the context. And I think even then I remember being very dissatisfied and unhappy with what I was learning, until I was able to find approaches that do address the context. But I do see that that has changed over a period of time, and I think it's too little, I think, and there are very few conversations, but I feel that it's hopeful because I see more and more spaces where people, I think, are voicing their experiences. And I think that's, as practitioners, that's so important for us to listen to the people about who we are diagnosing or talking, or the people who we are so-called treating or helping recover. I think it becomes really important for us to think about even language, for that matter, and how language itself can be so oppressive. So I see some of those conversations happening in very small circles now, which is a change or a shift.
Thank you so much, Jay. So just going on to the next question quickly. What have been the challenges to providing accessible and responsive mental health care services to people from socio-political marginality specifically? As you were speaking, there have been a number of ways in which it has evolved as a profession in itself and as a practice in itself. So how is it that responsive mental health care has come about?
So I think, like I said, it's very little and few and far between. I'm going to say that again. I think a lot more work needs to be done by practitioners, a lot. I think it's just there's so many barriers. Like you look at just a simple thing when somebody walks into a clinic, there are so many clinics where, you have to fill in a form, the language of the form, the things that you have to take off. So when you're talking about, people who are gender fluid, for example, who are forced to put themselves into one or two or three categories of gender, there's no a lot of our understandings are around able-bodied understandings. A lot of the services are provided in English. So there's so many barriers to accessibility, and I think an awareness around being accessible in terms of language, making sure that you're kind of making room for diversity and really creating that space for everybody's experience to not be erased. What Preeti was talking about, when I see somebody in front of me as a practitioner, it becomes my responsibility to try and understand sort of the socio-political location of that person, and also how all of these are intersecting, like she rightfully pointed out. Because if I just see a woman in front of me, I'm missing something. But I need to see all of those things and how those things might all be coming together, and being willing to create space for those experiences and conversations around that. I think will improve sort of the possibility of people actually relating to their therapist, rather than me being this practitioner who sort of brainstorms and comes up with an action plan for you. Because there's a real push, I think, for productivity, for making people go back to what society has sort of identified as a person who's doing well. You have to have a job, or you have to be doing something, you have to be a certain amount of happy all the time. So these kind of things, which are who decided these? None of us question it, right? It's ways of sort of what Shivangi was talking about. It's a form of social control, right? Of institutionalizing the human experience, and that as practitioners, for us to try and make space for all of these, I think will help people kind of relate more and access therapy more. Because otherwise, I've heard from so many people who are experiencing or who live in the margins, who speak about how it's a really horrible experience, and therapy actually ends up doing much more harm to them. And that where they find their spaces is in groups of people who've had similar lived experience, who can actually share life hacks of how they've managed this world, or how they've survived in these sort of oppressive systems. So yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you have. That was perfect. Thank you so much. And also that builds in very well into what Preeti and then later Shivangi have talked about. I think this was a very good perspective from the other side of the table for that. Now, coming to the last question that I would want you to stress upon is what are the methods of therapy that you practice? If you could talk a little bit about that. And also, because following from the context which has been set here, what are the ways in which you think mental health practitioners can make their methods of practice reflect the realities of mental health issues? As Shivangi also pointed out, certain inaccessibilities which are prevalent.
Thank you. So I think, for me, I've aligned myself to a practice called narrative practices, and I don't use the word therapy. I specifically use the word practices because it's something that can apply. It applies to my way of living, and then also to what I do in the therapeutic context. It's an approach that was developed in the 80s by in Australia and New Zealand in a lot of collaboration with Aboriginal communities. But I've worked a lot in understanding that approach. And I think what I really love is that it, calls out this fact that we're not neutral in the therapeutic space as therapists. We bring in, our own experiences, and we bring in our own values, and how important it is to acknowledge that. So to say that we're taking a political stand in the therapeutic space, we are taking up the responsibility to draw attention to the context and to make visible sort of systemic oppression for people when they come to us. And then we have, an idea that we believe that people are experts of their own life, that they have many skills, that they have a lot of knowledge of how to live and manage their problems, and that they're always responding. So while I'm drawing attention to the context, I'm also trying to draw out and make visible the things people are doing, to respond to this context, and then, look at alternative or preferred spaces. Spaces where maybe, as in these conversations, we can co-create other possibilities, of course, but it is really holding that stance that my knowledge is not at the center of this conversation, your knowledge is. And I think to respond to the second part of your question, so it's to think about what can practitioners do. I think it's a lot of it is about the stance that you take in the therapeutic space. Because like Preeti pointed out, of course, it's not possible for me to understand every intersectionality and every experience. I can't. I can only understand those that I have experienced, and I have the wisdom, that I learned from the people who come to me, which I think that's the biggest thing for me. Like, I'm always open and curious to learning about people's experience, and I take that as a responsibility. I make it my job to deconstruct power, because there is a power dynamic between a therapist and a person who comes to consult. It's almost like, because of how psychology and how the world is built, it's like if I say something, it's going to be taken as, as more important in this conversation. So it becomes my job to deconstruct that power and to sort of, make sure and make visible to people their own skills. I think it becomes really important to be aware of the things which are going on in the world. And, we speak about the fact that, once you shut the door in the therapeutic room, if you are not aware of intersectionality, of oppression, of, the things that are going around, it will stay outside the conversation. And it can do a lot of harm to the person, right? Because the problem is not located internally. It is so much a function of what's going on in the world. So those become our responsibilities. And we speak a lot about how, we are imperfect allies to people, because we're not, obviously there's so many things we don't know, but how do we, take that journey and be in solidarity with people, not to fix people. To witness their stories and really provide that space of solidarity for people, can be such a helpful thing. And the other thing I've found very useful in my practice is to link people together, people who have similar lived experiences, because I think what ends up happening is people on the margins are, often very isolated in their experiences. And I think, while you may be imperfect allies, the lived experience can really support people in a very different way, just to continue to live their story, to know there are other people, having the same life experiences and doing similar things, I think makes a very big difference. So, those are some of the things I would share as important.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was really a good summation of what we have been discussing so far. It is very integral to talk about it. And just to point out here that when we talk about reflexivity in various other forms, we talk about reflexivity in a number of different things, but reflexivity becomes almost the central principle when it comes to therapy and as a mental health practitioner, because being able to ensure that your politics and what you believe in are continuously reflected into your actions in the minutest of forms, I think is something that would take a lot of effort. Now, with that, I think we'll go on to Rashi. Thank you so much, Jay. Hi, Rashi. How are you doing? Hi. So I'll just follow the same format that I have been with everybody else. Is there something that you would want to say to introduce yourself apart from what I've already said?
Right. So maybe some people joined in later, so I can just maybe repeat. So hi everyone, my name is Rashi. I'm a mental health worker. I work with Mindpiper. Mindpiper is an impact-first mental health organization based in Delhi. What we do is make efforts to unpack mental health in such a way that it is more accessible to people, not only just in terms of reach, but also the concept and how it is being used. And I'm just kind of in a daze. I've just been hearing Preeti, Shivangi, and Jay, and I think so much of it has already been covered, but I just look forward to sharing a little bit of what my experience has been.
Okay, so we'll go on to the questions now, and trust me, you would have a lot to share from your own experience, apart from what the other panelists have very articulately presented. So the one thing that obviously does come up a lot in conversations regarding mental health is when we talk about inclusive mental health care, what are the various facets which weigh in on this effort as a mental health practitioner yourself?
Mm-hmm. So my first experience of reading about inclusivity has been in the boxed content at the end of our chapters, where we learn about other identities and everything that is other, everything that is not mainstream. So I think this really puts in a perspective of how the gaze has been towards inclusivity. It's a little, appendix sort of thing. And there's also another way of looking at it, which is now evolved, which is the putting a light on the little social aspect of the biopsychosocial model of mental health. So I happened to read some text by Erica Berman. She's a savage critical psychologist who says that it's only bio model of mental health, but इसे बस biopsychosocial बोलते हैं ढकने के लिए. But insights, the treatment and how research happens and what things are getting favored, it's all predominantly only one form of this understanding. And she gives a very nice metaphor that it's almost like taking that vanilla ice cream and dipping it in chocolate sauce to tell you it's chocolate ice cream, but it's not. It's just one layer, and inside it's all still vanilla. So I really like that metaphor. All right, so after the gaze, I think I use it to often center the fact what Dr. Travis Heath talks about, that the field of mental health now does not need any more theories of social justice. It needs more practices of social justice. And I strongly believe inclusive mental health care is just one form of that. Because if we are not doing it, we are directly reinforcing systems that put pressure on people's identities. That means people are driven to believe what they are allowed to be, how the society is sanctioned, how society sanctions them to believe, just what Jay was talking about. And coming to the practice of inclusive mental health care, I think I was sharing it with you earlier also, how I was just sitting with the title of this program today, which is along the lines of mental health and the other. And how I have come to realize that there is no other in this dialogue apart from the mental health discourse itself, which somehow ends up performing the othering. So I'll give you an example. I was in my first year of my clinical training where I learned about a rather pejorative view of people in therapy, that people with higher abstraction perform better in therapy as compared to those who are having low abstraction, low levels of articulation. So ये कौन लोग हैं जिनकी low abstraction होती है? वो लोग हैं जिन्हें education मिल नहीं पाया. वो लोग हैं who are facing systemic injustice and have faced this oppressive trauma. And जब ये theory हम सुनते हैं, it almost hits somewhere. It almost makes you feel like कि उन लोगों की गलती है जो therapy की भाषा नहीं समझ पाते. And in my training, I just felt like something is wrong with it, but only when I went into the practice, I understood why it's wrong. Because this language is itself alienating. And जो हम क्लाइंट को फेलियर जैसा महसूस करा रहे हैं, I firmly come to believe that clients can never fail in therapy. Only the therapeutic approach brought together by the therapist's characteristics or the school of therapy itself can do that. So those are some points that I feel we need to challenge, especially parts of what we are trained in. And also anything that around the word empirical or evidence-based becomes a red flag, because it is essentially a method to discredit जो भी traditional है, जो भी indigenous है, like what Shivangi was talking about right now, that spiritual practices in tarot card reading, somebody can actually just rub that off because it's not empirically validated by our own made up scientific processes. So if in the end, if there's any one question we can ask for some clarity around social inclusion, is that who benefits from making it exclusive, like just turning the gaze to the different side. For example, अगर कोई कह रहा है कि थेरेपी एक अच्छे से रूम में ही हो सकती है privacy के साथ, दो लोगों के साथ, who benefits from that conception? If somebody is saying that therapy should be a long drawn process with repeated sessions, who benefits from that? Because I have received some experience where therapy has happened in the waiting room of hospitals, where I am sitting and the client is sitting next to me. There are 3 people behind us sitting on the same waiting chair, but we know we can't access any other room, so that therapeutic conversation starts. It may not last for a long time. Sometimes it just lasts for 15-20 minutes. Sometimes people only come for one session and they never return. But who says and who benefits from saying that that is not therapeutic? So I guess what I'm saying is that inclusive mental health conversation starts from here, from this decolonization of these Western concepts, which we have also been training in and trying very hard to fit in the Indian context.
Okay, thank you so much, Rashi, for that. Now, just going forward and building up actually to what you ended with, as a mental health professional, how do you negotiate around socio-political context of clients that you might not personally understand or relate to? And this is coming from the decolonizing of mental health care and how regionally you negotiate with mental health while the practice and the discourse is largely still unrelated to the realities. So if you could elaborate.
Mm-hmm. So I was trained, we had these classes called socio-cultural context of the person, and it was not a boxed variety. It was a full class, like with full credits, and it was almost on multiculturalism, that as a therapist you should be multicultural, but more that I am being exposed to different kinds of therapists and the narrative approach, for example, like it's asking for something beyond multicultural. Like it's not just asking you to be someone okay with diversity, but I think the question you're asking, that itself is so important right now to reflect. And I can tell you a little bit about what I used to do before. I think when we start our careers, like this is almost my 4th year into practice, so it's been a while since I post-graduated, and in the beginning I had a lot of conviction that I'm going to understand all contexts and I'm going to try. And let me give you a little background. Like, so my home is in Patna, and my family has first degree relatives in US and also in our village. And we were in Patna, we were in like this middle position, and because of growing up in this family, I had to build this skill, this ability to form connections with both sets of people. And we spoke in Hindi only, but there was a difference, and I picked up that difference early on. And I have been exploring it, practicing it, and due to my conscious or unconscious affinity, I even got drawn to a workplace like Mindpiper, where I could recreate my home. So in a week, I have sessions with students who are from well-to-do colleges. I have sessions with people who can afford therapy at the rate it is. And I also work in community clinics, like I just talked about. And also I under a project with Center for Equity Studies, I have been working with people on the streets, people who are facing urban homelessness. So the question you're asking, it actually never occurred to me because I was always good at connecting with people. So it would set the relationship off. Like people would also have this, like I'm just trying to create like this bare minimum for you through which people would also always feel safe. So I thought, I am a multicultural therapist. I'm doing a good job. And then I think as I progressed, I began to notice that my clients are noticing my anxiety. There is a research that says babies soothe their mothers when the mother is anxious. And that tends to happen in therapy as well. So they realize that this one is trying to empathize, but probably does not know a lot about my context. So whether it would be my client who was differently abled, or one of my clients who comes from a middle income neighborhood in Delhi who recognizes as a gay person, but his father brought him to therapy because he wanted me to do something about it. And whether it be the client who hails from a tier 2 city, not understanding their concerns around anxiety and OCD, or my client who's serving right now in the army and is middle aged. So they all started educating me by themselves, context that I did not have information about. And only it's very recently that I've understood that somewhere my goal here was to care, कि मैं इतना अच्छा care करूं कि उस care में कोई फर्क ना हो. And that care, whether you come from any context, and I can uphold I felt that my quality of therapy is same, and I've been doing a good job. And to some extent, I think that's true, but it has taken me some time to understand that that is not the goal. Like, the goal is not to care so much that it is equal for all. The goal is to see the person's identity and to convey to the person, communicate and tell them that I respect that I see what they've gone through, and that I honor them, that I will be educated about your lived experiences, and I will work against the dominant discourse that harms you, and tell me how to do better. Just what Preeti said, like, I've made notes, like she hit the pulse so right when she called it sincere assurance. And when Jay was saying that it is our responsibility to be curious. So it has taken me some good amount of time, and I can't, once you see it, you can't unsee it, that how at one point I thought my goal is to not see the difference, to treat it as equal, to make sure that I am not making you feel like I'm noticing your identity.
Yeah.
Because I'm not noticing it. I'm just trying to help your problem, whatever you've brought in therapy, be it a relationship issue. Like, I'm not noticing what your orientation is. I'm just noticing the issue. But that is somewhere not the goal, is what I've realized.
Thank you so much, Rashi. Very honestly, all this conversation was very overwhelming for me personally as well. Just trying to understand the context, and very honestly, I've never had such honest discussions with people who are accessing therapy and people who are providing therapy, coming together on a single platform to talk about where is it that we lag and where is it that we are doing well to a certain extent. And it has been truly interesting, to say the least.
I'd like to say that sometimes this therapist character, like, it is of very much interest to me. Like, this character only comes in our way of genuinely connecting, like even genuinely connecting to other therapists or clients, or to, let's say, people like us.
Just a small announcement. Anybody who has questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. And we'll wait for 2-3 minutes in case if there are any questions, then the panelists can try to address it. And in the meanwhile, I think till we start getting any questions, if all the panelists could switch on their video and audio, and if there are any concluding remarks that you would like to make regarding how the discussion went forward today and what you felt, then that would be great as well. I think we can have a few seconds for each of you, maybe 2 lines. I'm sorry for being this teacher type, but we're running short on time.
So I'd just like to conclude what I was saying, because I just came out of a moment of clarity for me, that somehow this therapist character only comes in the way of our genuine connection. And I have been trying to create some tiny ruptures in my therapy sessions, and I just want to report it's working really well. like when all of a sudden I disclose more than what is sanctioned by my training, or if I, let's say, use humor to cause that connection, or when I'm just taking a different route to understanding our identity. So I just feel somehow we are often trained to be the therapist, but how to be ourselves in this unique setting that is therapy. So yeah, I'm very excited to see more of practitioners and clients, breaking the way therapy really works. That'll be really interesting for me.
I'm reminded of a quote by Arundhati Roy, and it goes, something about how to respect strength but never power, and to make it a responsibility to never forget the things that we see. And it just came up for me when Rashi was talking about, it's hard to unsee. It's so important to see. It really is, and I think that's something that's really standing out to me.
Preeti,
Yeah, I think I just want to say one line that I'd like to register is that experience itself is different from agreement with that experience and empathizing with it. So I think this is one very important thing we need to keep in mind.
Shivangi, are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Any concluding remarks?
No.
No? Okay. So we have one question. Okay, finally. So many adolescents are affected by this pandemic as they are isolated and alone, trying to explore one's identity and tips to suggest them. Um, so any one of you wants to take this forward? Should I repeat the question? Okay, I'll just repeat the question. Many adolescents are affected by this pandemic as they're isolated and alone, trying to explore one's self-identity. And I think the person, Sirisha, is trying to ask tips that you can possibly suggest them. So I think I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to take it up.
I guess I'll say something. So I mean, disabled people have been like self-isolating or, been alone in their homes for a really long time. I guess one of the tips that I would say when trying to understand yourself is to just rest. Resting is very important, and not pressuring yourself into understanding everything about yourself, because it's difficult when you're alone. And now, right nowadays, we have such a huge online community, and there is a platform where you can, like, online, where you can go and you can speak and you can ask questions, and you can go and interact with people and find your community online. That's how disabled people have been interacting for a very long time. And yeah, I mean, just taking care of yourself is the biggest part of it, where you're aware of what you're eating, and you're aware of what's around you, looking at the colors around you, looking at the smells and the different sensations around you, what you're feeling in your body, and just making your environment, the room that you're in, something that reflects your heart, and what you want to be. And that's applicable for a lot of people queer people who are in the closet, like having a closet space which is beautiful, and which reflects who you are, is really or how you want it to look, is really helpful. And it's also helpful to understand, like I said before, about your about spiritual healing. That's another aspect that you can do while you're while you're at home to like follow healers and spiritualists, whatever spiritual practice that you believe in, or even exploring other spiritual practices. It has been really helpful for me, at least when I have been self-isolated as a disabled person.
Adding to the question, yeah, I think self-care and rest is very important in these times, and not having somebody to pitch yourself against, which is usually how we try to be reflexive about ourselves, where we are trying to reflect on ourselves by telling and sharing it with people whom we consider peers and equals, or who have similar experiences, and then trying to get validation out of it. Because for many of us, the sense of self is not located within. The sense of self, for me personally, I've realized, is very external. Like, I need people to tell me that what I'm feeling is not like completely out of bounds in some way. So yeah, it is difficult. And online spaces, I think, should be able to a certain extent, replace um, other forms of intimacy that we are used to. Um, so I think we still haven't gotten the question. I think we will be closing the segment now. And Rashi, please do share your email ID and social media handles if you have any, to know and interact with each one of you. It has been a pleasure. And thank you so much for taking time out for us and doing this. Thank you so much. All right, bye.
Thank you. Bye.